Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we delve into a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is January 20th. On this day in 1998, the murder of 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe rocked the quiet town of Escondido, California. What followed was not only a devastating loss for the Crowe family, but also a deeply flawed investigation that led to the coerced confession of Stephanie's older brother Michael, as well as years of legal turmoil. Today, we'll explore the tragic events surrounding Stephanie's murder, the missteps, the breakthroughs, and the lingering questions surrounding the murder of Stephanie Crowe. Let's get started. Stephanie Crowe was a bright, outgoing 12-year-old who was deeply loved by her family and friends. Known for her love of music, excellent grades, and close bond with her siblings, Michael and Shannon, Stephanie brought joy to those around her. On January 20th, 1998, Stephanie's typical day ended with her going to bed. She was in her own room at home, a place where she should have been safe. But the next morning, her family awoke to an unimaginable nightmare. Stephanie's grandmother discovered her lifeless body on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed 9 times. The scene was horrifying, and the Crowe family's world was shattered in an instant. Police arrived at the Crowe home and began their investigation immediately. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, which puzzled investigators. Without clear evidence pointing to an intruder, their focus turned inward, and their suspicions soon centered on Stephanie's 14-year-old brother, Michael. Michael's behavior during questioning caught the attention of investigators. They described him as emotionless and detached, and they interpreted these reactions as signs of guilt. However, experts have long said that trauma affects people differently, and Michael's reaction may have just been a natural response to the shock of losing his sister, especially in such a brutal way. Despite a complete lack of physical evidence tying Michael to the crime, investigators zeroed in on him as their prime suspect. Their theory is that he had killed Stephanie in a moment of either anger or sibling rivalry. This assumption set the stage for a deeply flawed investigation. Over the course of several days, Michael Crowe underwent intense interrogations. Detectives used tactics designed to break down his resistance, including lying about evidence and suggesting that he had suppressed the memories of committing the crime. And just as a reminder, it is completely legal in this country for police to lie to a suspect during an interrogation. So everything that they were doing was technically legal, though ethically, maybe that's a different story. In Michael's case, police even told him that Stephanie's blood had been found in his room, a claim that was entirely false and was deeply upsetting to a boy who had just lost his sister. Michael was a 14-year-old in an interrogation room alone, without a lawyer and without his parents. After days of relentless questioning and lies, Michael eventually buckled under the pressure. He confessed to the murder, though his confession was vague and riddled with inconsistencies. Forensic psychologist Dr. Richard Ofshay, an expert in false confessions, later testified that Michael's statements bore all of the hallmarks of a coerced confession. He said, quote, "This was not a voluntary confession, but the result of psychological manipulation," end quote. The arrest of Michael devastated the Crowe family even further. His parents, Steve and Cheryl, were adamant that their son was innocent, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. For police, Michael's confession seemed like the breakthrough they needed, even though the evidence didn't align with his statements. But that wasn't even the worst of it. After Michael's confession, police expanded their investigation to include two of his friends, Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser. Both boys, aged 15 and 14, were subjected to similar coercive interrogations without lawyers or parental supervision. Under this intense pressure, Joshua eventually confessed, claiming he and Aaron had conspired with Michael to murder Stephanie. Like Michael's, Joshua's confession was riddled with inconsistencies and unsupported by any physical evidence. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking the boys to this crime, prosecutors moved forward with charges. The case drew national attention, with many legal experts criticizing the methods used by the investigators. Defense attorney Paul Finkst argued, quote, "This case is a textbook example of how coercion can lead to false confessions, especially in children," end quote. As the case unfolded, the defense highlighted glaring holes in the prosecution's theory. There was no DNA, fingerprints, or blood evidence tying Michael, Joshua, or Aaron to Stephanie's murder. And then, a new lead emerged that changed the course of the entire investigation. So while all of this was happening and Michael and his friends faced murder charges, it turns out that a pretty important lead had been overlooked. Richard Tweet, a transient known for erratic behavior, had been seen wandering the Crowe family's neighborhood on the night of Stephanie's murder. Witnesses reported that Tweet had been knocking on doors, behaving aggressively, and appeared disoriented. Despite these witness accounts, Tweet was initially dismissed as a suspect. But I guess he was looked into enough that they did take his clothing for DNA testing, though they didn't initially test any of his clothing. But in 1999, they did, and DNA testing provided a real breakthrough in Stephanie's case. Tweet's clothing that had been tested had blood on it, and that blood was matched to Stephanie's DNA. This revelation prompted prosecutors to drop all charges against Michael, Joshua, and Aaron, though those charges were dismissed with prejudice, meaning that they could be brought again in the future. Despite the blood evidence, Richard Tweet wasn't charged with Stephanie's murder until 3 years later in 2002. His trial began in 2004, and he was convicted not of murder, but of a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. However, his conviction was overturned in 2013 due to procedural errors, and he was retried in 2015. This time, though, he was acquitted. After 17 years and the nightmare of the false allegations against Michael, Stephanie's case was once again unresolved, and nobody was facing justice for her murder. For the Crowe family, the pain of losing Stephanie was compounded by Michael's wrongful arrest. Steve Crowe, Stephanie's father, later reflected on the ordeal, saying, quote, "We lost our daughter, and then we had to fight to clear our son's name. It was a nightmare no family should ever have to endure," end quote. Although the charges were dropped against Michael, the emotional scars from his false confession and the public scrutiny remained. The Crowe family ended up suing the cities of Escondido and Oceanside, and in 2011, they settled the suit for $7.25 million. The families of Michael's friends also sued, and I believe also settled out of court. The next year, in 2012, a judge finally ruled that Michael and his friends were all factually innocent. And this is important because remember, yes, the charges were dismissed over a decade before that, but with prejudice. So this was still hanging over all of their heads. You know, they were going through the whole thing with Richard Tweet, but prosecutors could have decided at any moment, nope, we're going to go back to Michael and his friends. So it's hard to imagine the stress that Michael and his family must have been under for that decade. So thankfully, he was officially exonerated and declared factually innocent. Stephanie Crowe's murder has become a pivotal case in discussions about wrongful accusations and the dangers of coercive interrogation techniques. The mishandling of the investigation prompted calls for reform, including stronger protections for minors during police questioning and stricter standards for confession evidence. Today, Michael Crowe's case is studied in legal and psychological circles as an example of how investigations can go tragically wrong. Despite the lingering pain, the Crowe family has worked to honor Stephanie's memory by advocating for systemic changes to prevent similar injustices. Stephanie Crowe's murder remains a deeply painful chapter in true crime history. While DNA evidence did point to Richard Tweet, his acquittal and the flawed investigation have left her case unresolved. Stephanie's story reminds us of the importance of seeking justice not only for the victim, but also for those wrongly accused. Her legacy endures as a symbol of the need for fairness and accountability in our justice system. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing and leaving a rating and review of our podcast. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another milestone in true crime history. Stay safe, and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!